Yes.
Robert, you were a registrant of the Macfarlane Trust from the outset.
Yes.
And you attended meetings with the Macfarlane Trust, both in that capacity and also as part of the Birchgrove groups.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's
From 1989, you've noted in your statement that there were a lot of concerns being raised about the Macfarlane Trust, both by individuals and by Birchgrove. Can you tell us about those concerns?
Yes, they were. I can remember a number of meetings, and the main issues were about the organisation, how slow it was to make decisions initially, particularly on initial grants. When you had people who were dying of AIDS in hospital and they were going home to die for the last few days, you couldn't wait a month for a committee to meet to decide whether they could have some equipment. The process that people would have to go through to get those single grants, which again, when you've got someone either who's really ill or someone who's caring for the person who's really ill, it always seemed too many hoops and boundaries and difficulties. The chair at the time, I can remember at meetings when anger was expressed to him, the Reverend Alan Tanner, it just kind of didn't seem to have any impact on him. I spoke to one of the trustees afterwards, and they said he interprets all this anger about the poorness of the administration as us just being angry because we got HIV, rather than we had a legitimate concern that this organisation was not doing what it was meant to do. It obviously dropped the bereaved very quickly. And then later with Birchgrove, as we would speak amongst each other about what grants people had got and what they hadn't got, how they'd got them, who they'd spoken to, who they hadn't, the just complete inconsistency. When something was available and then it wasn't, the push for... Eventually some guidelines were written, but they were just so vague. A health need. And it was like, well, what can you get and what can't you? And some people getting some things and some getting others. The one I particularly remember, and we wrote about it in Birchgrove magazine, was the issue of sperm washing that wasn't available, then it was available, then it wasn't available, and then I think it was available. And it was just, that seemed to typify this back and forth of the group that was making those decisions. And the first two members of staff, one was the administrator and one was a social worker, and the administrator was just so gruff and blunt that they did not come across as sympathetic. And this was, to a group of people where, yes, a lot of us were angry about what had happened, but also we were angry because these systems were not working. It did not do what it was meant to do. And
in the early 90s, Birchgrove produced a number of reports or commissioned reports, sometimes with the Haemophilia Society,
yes.
Sometimes with the Macfarlane Trust.
Sometimes we convinced them to pay for it, yes.
Can you tell us about them and how they came to be produced?
They came out of frustrations always. That I think the first one that the Macfarlane Trust did itself was a customer service reply, and that was because we were saying you're not doing what you're meant to do. You're taking too long. Your administrative processes are poor. You're inconsistent, and they employed a company and they produced a report. And the report just said they were really good because they answered the phone quickly, or they turned around letters very quickly. And it wasn't, as I mentioned in my statement, my friend who was chair of Birchgrove at the time, it doesn't matter how long it takes them to answer the phone, it's what they say when they answer it that mattered. And that was what we were trying to get at. So after that...
Can we just stay with that survey report? It's the Public Attitude Survey report, the PAS report, which was in 1994. The criticism of Birchgrove, as I understand it, was that it had, as you say, dealt with the speed of answering the phone, but not the substance. Can you unpack that a little bit more for us? What did Birchgrove feel should have been addressed?
what should have been addressed was, first of all, being, sounds awful, but being nice to people on the phone, being sympathetic, being understanding when people were angry, because that shouldn't be surprising and upset. That having a system that allowed them to make a decision quickly, and also being able to provide things that were needed, and as our needs changed, coping with that quickly. And I know to some extent that's difficult, but that was their job. It was that they would refuse things and then agree them later when it was out of date. It was the substance of the communication rather than the process of the communication, and we very much felt that the report just ignored substance. It went totally about process, and it just missed the whole point of our complaints about what they were saying to us, the way they were being inconsistent.
Before the PAS report, there had been a discussion document produced by Birchgrove in November '93 called Living with Haemophilia and HIV. Just backtracking to that.
Yes.
What was that dealing with?
That came out of a conference, a Birchgrove conference, and just talking about the difficulties of the Macfarlane Trust and why they were so difficult and why they were not meeting needs, and they were why they had decided that their sole purpose was to give out little bits of money in a sort of slow process, rather than providing services in a wider way, rather than supporting people, supporting each other, those types of things. And a couple of the people in Birchgrove wrote that report saying this is a better way forward. And widening their services, if not necessarily demanding lots of money off them. So, it was then very disappointing when we got a report back of their own making, which was just a process one.
And then after the PAS report, there was the Keeping It in the Family study, which was done between Birchgrove and Haemophilia Society.
Yes.
And after that, the Voice of the Registrants document in 1998. Those last two... What were their themes?
With those, we tried to be a bit broader. When you're continuously trying to get someone to do something differently or change or get better, and it's not getting anywhere, you try different tactics. So the first one of those, Keeping It in the Family, was, well, maybe if we make it a wider thing, and it's not just you need to do something, but it takes that much more politic line of, well, we need to do something, you need to do something, the Haemophilia Society need to do something, and let's all work together, and then we all get something done. And that had a number of recommendations across different areas. And the Voice of the Registrants, I think, came out because there was always a need for a needs assessment. Before the Macfarlane Trust prepared to do things, they would always talk about, well, we need to do a needs assessment. So we'd do one, and then it'd be out of date by the time we'd got round to doing something, so they'd do another needs assessment. And that was one of the ways we thought that if we can get, the voice of the registrants, what people feel they need and what is important to them, then it becomes a much longer lasting document. We can go back to it a few years later and say, if we look at that, you can see here some of the things that are needed.
So Birchgrove were producing these reports over the years, providing them to the Macfarlane Trust, and what was the response that you got in relation to them?
The response was generally, it's a kind of a civil service response, I suppose. It was, oh, yes, we need to do better, and we can look at these things. And, I mean, there would be small things that would change, but the fundamental ability of the organisation to do what it was meant to do never changed. And the idea of it moving into other areas just took so long. They did, after a long time, start to provide finances to run residential weekends so people could get together. And so Birchgrove stopped having to raise money for that, which was, of course, a great help. And then when they'd had the first couple, and it was suddenly, this is such a great idea, and that felt so frustrating. We've been telling you for ages to do this, and you finally get to do it, and you think, isn't it really good? And they ran for quite a long time, and they had a big impact on people, as the Birchgrove conferences had, bringing people together and families.
The partnership group then came into existence. What was your involvement in that?
Well, I discovered a letter actually I'd had that I wrote to Peter Stevens about the partnership group quite early on, where I said, what is the point of this group? What is it trying to do? And it reminded me that it formed actually out of a previous committee which was organising events, and that was to organise some of the initial weekends. There was a few from the Haemophilia Society, a few people from Birchgrove, and a few from the Macfarlane Trust. And it was a task group. You did the event. And then, they decided to introduce the partnership group, and they really just migrated everybody over from that to this. And it was meant to be a form of communication between the registrants who were interested in going forward and the trust itself. It was actually the second attempt they'd had to do that. When it first formed, they wrote to people and asked if they could have I think it was a letter group for consultation. But as far as I can tell, it never consulted. I wrote back and said I'd happily join, and I got a letter saying I'd joined, and then I don't think I was ever consulted on anything. So the partnership group, we did at least get the chance to discuss things, and some quite strategic higher level, such as the approach you're taking of dribbling the money out very slowly will not work with government. You need to run it down to nothing and embarrass them. And only when they're embarrassed are they going to stump up more cash. And that was a big source of tension on the two sides between some of us and the way that those running the trust saw it. Not prepared to support campaigning. That also seemed annoying. If you won't do it publicly, will you provide support facilities for it?
One of the things you were particularly sought to achieve was having registrants on the trust board.
Yes.
And you sought to become a trustee.
Yes. I offered myself to be a trustee at a meeting very early on, and it was when it became apparent, or I think it was announced at the meeting, and it was probably the registrants at the meeting asking, are any of the trustees paid for the role they do? And it came out that no, but it is possible to be a paid trustee, and you can't be a trustee as registrants because you get money out of us. It's just not possible. So I said, well, how about we convert the amount of money you give me, because I was getting I think it was a £15 a week regular payment. Let's convert that to a wage, pay me as a trustee, and I won't apply for any single grants. And the Reverend Alan Tanner then, we didn't really say no. He just said, well, what skills have you got? How can you be a trustee? And rather sweetly, my father pointed out I had a couple of degrees. I was a qualified social worker, and I was chair of a number of voluntary organisations. But that seemed to typify that resistance. And yes, so ever after that, we were pushing, or I was pushing, I have a particular belief in patient involvement. If someone's making decisions about me and my life, I want to be involved in that decision. I don't want to be taken over my head. We pushed for many years at the partnership group meeting. I'm sure it appeared in some of those reports that wouldn't it be useful to have that voice at a trustee level, at a decision-making level?
You lobbied for user trustees for a very long time, and you say in your statement that the Trust's reluctance to agree was another sign of the reluctance of these trusts to expose themselves to criticism. What did you mean by that?
they were just very bad at criticism. As I said, there was that first point of the chair putting it down to our anger at our diagnosis rather than any problems with it. That the trustees often seemed aloof and difficult. The way they would talk about some registrants didn't feel comfortable. Probably the nicest way I could put it. That a lot of them just lived in a different world. If you were a well-paid civil servant who lived in the home counties and you had a family and you could decide what to do with money, that's very different to not having any money when one of your family's dying. And that lack of awareness of the way we were living our lives, what quite a number of us were living with, that the issues around poverty and stigma, they just didn't seem to get. And I thought, well, we've tried criticising them. If you don't get this, you don't understand this, and you're not responding to this, let's have someone at that board level. And it would also cut out that ability of, say, the staff to go, well, that's a trustee decision, and trustees to go, well, that's a staff decision, and move it back and forth. The response to criticism is always things like, we haven't got enough money, or we can't do that. It's not campaigning, often our criticisms. Or, yeah, as I've said, yes, we need to learn from this and we need to get better.
You were also involved in the consultations about the setting up of the Skipton Fund. How did you come to be involved in those discussions?
Well, if I remember rightly, when they announced the Skipton Fund, and I can actually remember it at work because someone said to me, I think you've just been given some money, which is a bit odd. And they then had a system of how is this going to work? What is it going to be? Partly about how much, how many categories will there be, and that type of thing. And one of the consultations was about, can you divide up people with hepatitis C of those, if you like, who've got no problems yet, those who are quite ill with it, and is there a way of doing that? And so I wrote back and thought, well, cirrhosis is an easy way of doing that, but there are problems with doing it with cirrhosis because if FibroScan is not common, then you can only find, well, apart from certain symptoms like ascites, you will know that from a biopsy, and we shouldn't be having biopsies because they're dangerous. So you've got to have in a system that will accept cirrhosis more generously, or acknowledge the effects that aren't just around the liver. In the hepatology world at the time, there was quite a bit about they were just starting to accept that outside of problems that you get with the liver, hepatitis C, also you get problems with other parts of your body. The commonest one everyone talks about is brain fog, but there were also other ones. And it was trying to acknowledge, you've got to acknowledge that at government level as well when you're doing that.
That was your kind of suggestions to them.
Yes.
Did you participate in any discussions and meetings? As well?
No, I didn't go to any meetings. I did have conversations with Peter Stevens about it, who was chair of the Macfarlane Trust, because I thought it was inevitable they would get asked to run it. And that was lobbying, arguing that if it was going to go to people with Hep C, it had to go to everyone with Hep C, and that it shouldn't exclude those with HIV. And particularly because at the time, as the hepatitis group pointed out, and I noticed in one of Professor Hayes' very early letters about hepatitis C, he even noticed it, HIV accelerates Hep C. So the people who died first of liver disease were predominantly, and it was a huge predominance, 80, 90%, the first 100, had HIV as well. And we were the group at that point in large part getting ill, with other people with monoinfection getting ill later on. So to exclude us, I thought I was completely wrong. And I also felt the government isn't going to work on dividing money up. It's going to set a figure that sounds nice, and then it'll just calculate how much that's worth, which is what they did. They picked a 20,000, and I can't remember the other one. Was it 50? And then it multiplied up. It wasn't that they started with a set figure of 3 million and divided it up.
So you made these suggestions of how you thought that particularly the categorisation should be done. What response did you get to that?
I didn't get any individual response, I don't think. I assume the government produced a document which highlighted what had been said in the consultation. That's a fairly standard practice. But and then they set it up the way it was with the rules as they were.
Robert, I want to move on to your involvement and patient involvement in the development of treatments, your role as a treatment activist. Firstly, in relation to HIV, can we start with the UK Community Advisory Board?
Okay, yes. The UK CAB is a group that I was part of the setting up of and part of making it a bit more independent from the original organisation it was very closely linked with. It brings together treatment activists in the HIV sector, so it's predominantly people with HIV. It has about 300 members. We have an online forum, and the specific reason for bringing it together was because pharmaceutical companies would often claim to have done consultation with the community, which was in HIV, they'd invite the half dozen people with HIV that they knew and talk to them, and then it would come out. And a friend of mine, Simon Collins, he felt that was completely wrong. We needed something independent. If you're going to consult, actually consult. And so he got together a group of people that he thought would be good, which included myself, very nicely. And we would then invite those pharmaceutical companies who were presenting their trials or planning a trial to come and expose themselves to us and talk about it. We did initially try charging them for it, but they were so bad at paying and so slow that we gave up trying to get them to contribute money. It just wasn't worth it. It cost more staff time or work time or volunteer time than it did for the few £100s to pay for the room and people's travel expenses. And we would then question them on that, and we would push them to trial those drugs in the right sort of people. So in HIV, if you have people who are resistant to some drugs and there's a new drug in that category, you want to know if it's going to work in that group or not. From the pharmaceutical company perspective, they want to make a profit. So they don't want to trial it. They want to trial it in the people it's most likely to work in. So it was often around that. The other issue, particularly at the start, was side effects. Tell us what the side effects are and in detail what those side effects are. Certainly at the very beginning there was this phrase they would say about any drug generally well tolerated, and that all that really meant was that nobody died during the treatment. You had no sense of what that was. So it was getting them, and now you can see in most trial papers when they're published, it will list the side effects. They're specifically mentioned and they're graded in terms of severity. So a lot of it was around that, and then also interactions with other medications. So if you're going to produce a treatment, the people take other medications. If it's going to be available to women, some of them take the contraceptive pill. You need to know if it works together, if it does a problem. If they've got liver disease and they're taking interferon, if it works with that. A variety of those medicines, and those have become more standard, not just through the UK CAB, but there's also a European group and some US groups that have been lobbying that.
You've also been very involved in relation to hepatitis C treatment.
Yes.
And you've been involved in two international groups. Firstly, HCAB. Can you tell us who they are?
HCAB was set up by a woman, a friend of mine, Tracy Swan, who worked in New York, the Treatment Action Group, I think they're called. And it was just when the DAAs were appearing for the first time, and we knew that they looked very promising, and we desperately wanted to make sure that their trials included the people who had cirrhosis and who had HIV, and that they wouldn't be excluded from the trials in the way they had been excluded from the first trials with interferon, pegylated interferon ribavirin. And also to try and particularly get drug companies when they were setting up trials, to set up trials to include those groups, but also include more women in the trials, more black people, to make them more similar to the group of people who are actually going to be treated with the drug. And it's an interesting experience, because once you start to learn this stuff and you read all these papers repeatedly, when you meet some of the pharma companies, they know less than you. And that's quite a valuable source of influence. But also, certainly for me, that was very surprising that I know the results of another trial that you don't. So that's only because I read it. You could have read it in a journal. And it was a group of us, and we developed some trust with the pharma companies in that they would give us results in advance sometimes, not always. And some would take on board changes to the way they ran trials. Some were much more resistant. One in particular, all their trial design was done by head office, was never done locally or regionally, and it didn't even seem to be done by the person who was specialist in that area. It was just cut and pasted. So they would forever have exactly the same exclusion criteria. And changing, to try and get, when you've got a new drug, you want to give it to the sickest people. So you want to know how it has an impact in those people. And I got a few free trips to the US, which was, they're silly with their money, drug companies.
You were a member of that group from 2007 to 2013.
Yes.
And then there's also the EATG that you were a member of. You became a member in 2014.
Yes.
Can you tell us about the EATG?
Yeah, it's the European AIDS Treatment Group, and it's a group of people across Europe and Central Asia. It follows the World Health Organization, has regions, and that's the Europe region. And they lobby around treatment, a lot on treatment availability in Eastern Europe, but also, again, meeting pharmaceutical companies to try and get them to change their trial criteria. It was another way of lobbying the same companies. We could lobby their US representatives through HCAB and their European ones through EATG, and they specifically had a particular regular meeting. We also always argue with them about price, because they're obscenely overpriced drugs, almost always. We never get anywhere on that one. But sometimes it can be nice just to have a go at someone who works for a company. Why is your company so obscenely overpricing this drug? And to promote trials in Eastern Europe, because, again, pharmaceutical companies are just rubbish at this. They'll say, oh, well, you can't do it in Eastern Europe, there's no network, and we'll send them the same document we've been sending them for the last so many years, saying, here is the list of all the hospitals that can do it and have done trials in Eastern Europe. And it's also a way of spreading knowledge between different countries in Europe. So I can particularly remember an email contact with a member in Greece, and she was saying at the time, it was during Greece's financial crisis, how unavailable the DAAs were there, and they'd only treated, I can't remember if it was 400 or 600 people. And I wrote back and said, well, we're not in a financial crisis, and we've treated exactly the same number. It's not just your government that's slow.
You've also been a member of the British HIV Association Hepatitis Committee, is that right?
Yes, it's the group that it writes the clinical guidelines. BEVA, from its second set of guidelines onwards, has always had patient involvement, so community involvement as it's called, and I'm the community person on the guidelines for co-infection, HIV and Hep C, HIV and Hep B. And it also used to organise a co-infection conference that it hasn't been needed so much since the DAAs have become much more prevalent and available. And it does odd bits of pressing about availability of drugs. And at the moment, its main feature is writing guidelines.
Through that committee, you've participated in a number of health technology assessments, and I want to look at one in particular. But before we go to the detail, can you explain what the purpose of those assessments is and the role that the Hepatitis Committee plays?
Right, yes. Initially, we had an issue around postcode prescribing, as it's called. So you get different drugs in different parts of the country. And then the government set up NICE, the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, if I've got its title right, because it changes it. And the idea was they would look at a drug, they'd say it's cost effective, and then 3 months later it becomes available to everyone on the NHS where a doctor's prescribed it. And when it's doing new drugs, it invites what it calls stakeholders, so people interested in around that, to comment on those drugs. And generally you register yourself so you can push to be involved in. So in terms of the hepatitis drugs, the DAAs, Beaver Hepatitis Group would have involved the British Society of Gastroenterology, all those sorts of things, the Hep C Trust, all those would register as stakeholders, and then we could put in comments about this drug, lobbying for or maybe against it.
And your involvement in the health technology assessments in relation to hepatitis C treatments had a very personal perspective.
Yes,
initially. Could you tell us the personal perspective, and then we'll go to the general.
All right, yeah. Initially, when they did pegylated interferon and ribavirin, and they were looking at it being, was it cost effective, was it not, and therefore would it be available on the NHS? First of all, I was co-infected with HIV, so one of the things I was lobbying for, make it available for me as well. Don't just say everyone with Hep C only and nobody else. And also make it available for people who've got Hep B as well as Hep C. And I also had a genotype. The type of Hep C I had was genotype 5, which was extraordinarily unusual. I ended up writing a paper about it simply because I couldn't find any information about it. As far as I could tell, at that point, there were very few people who'd been treated with it, and I don't think anyone had been treated with pegylated interferon and ribavirin. And the way the initial guidelines were written, I felt was logically inconsistent, in that initially it talked about there being 3 genotypes, which was annoying because there were 6 at least, and that if you had type 1, you needed treatment for a year. If you had anything else, you needed treatment for 6 months. And we were at the point where we knew genotype 4 was almost certainly needed 12 months. So 5 and 6, I didn't want to be in a situation of taking it for 6 months, it not working, and then taking it for 12 months. And it also struck me as using just the precautionary principle. You go for the treatment duration that's longer, because then if it needs it, you get it. If it doesn't need it, we can work that out later, perhaps. And so I lobbied for it to be available to me, as well as certainly other people with HIV. I don't know of anyone else who'd got genotype 5. And it didn't work with the first one, but over successive repeat guidelines, it did work. And I did get the guidelines changed so that it said, if you've got 2 and 3, it's 6 months. Everything else will treat as a year. And then thankfully DAAs came along and made it a lot easier.
So you were lobbying through the health technology assessment alongside the lobbying you've already spoken about in terms of funding for your own treatment.
Yes. I produced a document that put together as much information as I could find, including some information from South Africa, which is one of the few places where it's prevalent. The genotype 5 is prevalent, and I managed to get in touch with a doctor there who treated a few patients. It was only about 6, I think, he treated, but that made it the biggest cohort we'd got of genotype 5 published anywhere, and I sent it to my PCT to say, please give me 12 months, and they did agree to it. And I collected opinion from as many experts in the hepatitis C and co-infection field as I could find. In effect, I produced a consensus statement on it.
And as you say, in your work in the Hepatitis Committee, that resulted in changed guidelines in relation to different genotypes.
Yeah, and that was the general hepatitis C, not the Beaver ones. They were if I lobbied hard enough, they'd change instantly. But it was the general guidelines for everyone with Hep C, so that anyone, it didn't matter whether they got HIV or not, if they had, genotypes 5 or 6, they would have that option at least.
I want to look a little bit more in detail at the health technology assessment for ledipasvir and sofosbuvir, which I understand you were involved in relation to the BEVA hepatitis C committee. Before we get to the committee's response, I would like to turn up a covering letter from NHS England to NICE. Could we have WITN 1004 007, please? This is the covering letter of the NHS England response to the ACD consultation, and we can see that they set out the significant change that's arisen from the introduction of oral treatment for hepatitis C in the third paragraph. The introduction of the oral treatments for hepatitis C is a major change in the management of this disease, and NHS England is supporting the implementation of these treatments in a stepwise fashion, with our previous early access scheme for decompensated cirrhosis, the second access scheme for all patients with cirrhosis soon to be available, and the formation of the work programme to establish access to oral drugs for patients with F3 liver fibrosis, in conjunction with an effective programme of surveillance for other patients and a focus on the specific needs of the complex patient groups with hepatitis C. And then over the page, we see in the second paragraph the potential impact of not adopting the stepwise implementation approach described above needs to be considered explicitly in terms of both suboptimal treatment of those with hepatitis C and the impact on the ability of the NHS to meet its wider obligations. That's the covering letter. I'm just going to go through some other documents and then ask you a question about them. If we can then turn to WITN 1004 008, please, Shumik. This is the NHS England response in full. We can see the question at the top, has all the relevant evidence been taken into account? To which the answer is yes, all current evidence has been taken into account. However, NHS England understand that new data in specific patient groups is continuing to emerge, and it would seem prudent to allow for a more extensive time period to enable NHS England to assess the emerging evidence under an evaluative process that can be managed centrally rather than dictated by statutory guidance. And then over the page, there is the question, are the summaries of clinical and cost effectiveness reasonable interpretations of the evidence? And we see the headings in relation to uncertainty in treatment effects. If we go to the next page, development of the evidence base. Then further down, the static nature of the cost effectiveness models, the omission of relevant treatment strategies, watchful waiting and treatment sequences, the opportunity costs of high-cost medications affecting large populations, raising points about the costs of treatment, and then the capacity constraints to offer treatment to all eligible patients, which reads, NHS England have already highlighted issues around capacity in feedback relating to TA330 sofosbuvir for treating chronic hepatitis C. NHS England believe these issues still remain despite feedback from clinicians that say otherwise. And then there are two further headings dealing with implementation of guidance and investment in increasing uptake of cheaper treatments. This is obviously their response that was produced for NICE. What was BEVA's Hepatitis Committee's understanding of what the NHS England was seeking to persuade NICE to do?
basically not make the drug available or ration it. I remember this. I had a rant about this. I remember to the Beaver Hepatitis Committee about the way this was written and the way they were doing it. These drugs, they're tablets. You take them for 12 weeks at most. Some take a bit less. It is not like interferon, which is 6 months, a year, involves injections, it involves tablets, difficult times, it's difficult to take tablet. Most of these tablets, it was a single tablet once a day. The side effects, actually, particularly for that combination, were much, much less. The idea that you needed suddenly new infrastructure to do it was just made up. And this, I think, every clinician, and certainly a number of the patient groups, understood this was a way of desperately delaying the availability of this drug to people. And to ration it without having the confidence to say, we want to ration it, and went against the purpose of NICE, which was to make decisions about whether drugs were or weren't available. And I particularly remember going through that document and pointing out things that I felt did not make sense, such as saying that, yes, that phrase, it would be prudent. I think I said that's the kind of thing an academic says when they haven't got a reason and want to sound like they've got one. They were saying there was uncertainty, and that the group that they didn't want it to be made available was the group where we had certainty, and that they were using the uncertainty in other groups as a justification for not making it available for the groups where we knew it worked. That just the way they cheated about the price. So with medicines, you get a list price, which is the official one, the kind of recommended retail price, which is always far more than the actual price anyone pays. And they used in their cost effectiveness calculation the list price of the new drugs. And okay, they then went to interferon ribavirin and they used the actual price, not the list price. And it's like you use both the same price or you don't do that comparison that way. There were a lot of things that really annoyed me about that. The way they the restrictions that they were just desperate to place on it, the sort of punitive, petty type restrictions that came later on with run rates. That annoyed me, that response.
The understanding of the Hepatitis Committee was that there were two issues. One was the suggestion from NHS England that there needed to be a new infrastructure to be able to manage how the drug was provided to patients and how it was to be used. And the second was the cost and cost-effectiveness question.
And the cost-effectiveness and cost question is understandable, and we get that. NHS England are paying the bill, so I can see that. But, the need to set up a new structure was simply a way of delaying it, because if there was a need to set up a new structure, you could delay NICE approval. But it wasn't meant to be you set one up purposely to delay things. You set one up when you need to. This was going to be easier. This needed less infrastructure.
And the Beaver Committee responded to the NHS response.
They toned down my rant, yes. They didn't use my...
If we could have a look at that, WITN 1004011, please. It was a joint response from Beaver and the British Association of Sexual Health and HIV. And it starts off, we're grateful to the NICE Appraisal Committee for allowing us to respond to comments received from NHS England with regard to the following treatments. Although we appreciate the financial constraints facing NHS England, we're not in agreement with their comments with regards to the publication and implementation thereafter of NICE technology assessments for the listed drugs. The letter then goes through challenging various parts of NHS England's response. We can see that the headings in the letter follow the headings of the response. But I want to go through to part 10, paragraph 10. It's on the 4th page of the PDF, please, Shumik. which reads, it's headed NICE, we strongly advocate that NICE's robust and validated processes remain independent both in terms of external influences on their decisions and that interventions are assessed on their own merits, not relative to the potential impact on other disease areas. We would urge NICE to move forward with its recommendations and for NHS England to engage fully with all stakeholders, including national organisations, patient advocacy groups, so that DAA-based treatment can be delivered efficiently and equitably. We would also suggest use of evidence-based clinical guidelines to guide use of particular DAAs in subgroups of patients. Why was that view taken and presented?
One of the things that NHS England did was, well, if you say these drugs, the DAs and Ledipasvir, Sofosbuvir initially, if they are given approval, then they did a calculation of taking everyone with Hep C in the country and assuming that they would want it within the first 6 months of it being licensed, which obviously was not going to be true, calculating it using that list price, and then saying we will have to cut all these areas. So it becomes a horrible emotional argument if someone is saying something like, well, we'll have to cut children's cancer budgets in order to fund your drugs. And that's not the way you should do things. I would say it reminded me also a lot of when we had an issue around Herceptin, and a lot of PCT chief execs at the time were all saying if Herceptin is licensed, we will have to cut every other budget we've got. And it was licensed, and it didn't result in that, because just the expectation and the way they'd done their calculation was just wrong. So it was trying to play off patient groups against one another. And although they didn't involve the other patient groups, using, emotional blackmail on us to say, accept the way they want to do it. The job of NICE was to make decisions about cost effectiveness, not that was it, and that was what it should do.
And this has been signed off by the chair of Beaver Hepatitis Society subcommittee, as well as the BASHH General Secretary. Were the views in this letter those of the whole committee?
Yes, yeah. And also, just 10 points, 4 pages. There was a lot. Yes, there were the whole committee. And there were other supportive letters that said similar things from some of the other clinical groups. The Royal College of Physicians, I think, lobbied about how delayed this health technology appraisal had been. The British Society of Gastroenterology, the British Viral Hepatitis Group, a number of other bodies were lobbying with very similar sorts of points.
And what was the outcome of this?
It was approved. It was passed its health technology appraisal. And then NHS England introduced rationing, which was not meant to be the way it was happened, but for reasons I don't quite understand, it was allowed that this was to be rationed. And so it was rationed in the way that there were only specific hospitals could prescribe the drugs. They all had to be in a ODN, and I heard from one doctor in London that they all had to meet on a Sunday because they wouldn't authorise an ODN unless every single clinician who was going to be involved in the prescribing was sat in the same room at the same point to set this up. And they would then, each hospital would be given a number of patients per month they were allowed to prescribe this for. They were not allowed to prescribe for any more. If they prescribed any less, it would then be cut in the way government budgets work. If you don't spend it all, they immediately reduce you the following year. It was just a very, it was a way of doing rationing. And they also managed to get it delayed, I think, I can't remember, it was an extra period of time before it was even available on the NHS. So, and sort of continuously pushing it back before people could get access to these medications.
you've indicated in your statement and referred to the judicial review by the Hepatitis C Trust on the rationing system, which was refused in 2016.
Yes, they took a judicial review on the grounds this is rationing. We don't have rationing when a drug is approved by NICE, but it seems we do.
And did the Hepatitis Committee do anything further in relation to that, or was that really the end of their involvement?
The end of our involvement in terms of NICE and approval, but then we would still produce. Well, in some ways, we stopped producing guidelines. We produced a list of best thing you can get in England, rather than guidelines of what would be the best drug to prescribe. It was much easier in Scotland because the Scottish. It's the SCM, I think the Scottish Committee on Medicines, if I've got the name right. They had approved far more DAAs. So in Scotland, they could prescribe the best combination, whereas in England, it was whatever NHS England is paying for.
I want to move on to my final area with you, and that is that you were particularly involved in the Living Histories project that was established. Can you tell us how that came to be set up?
That came to be set up. I'd met Sian Edwards, who's sat on one of the expert panels on the inquiry, when I moved to near London and became a patient at St Thomas's, and she would run, it was a nursing course, and they wanted a point where someone with HIV would come and talk about living with HIV, so I went and did that, and I became friends with her. And then later she came back and actually got a job as a nurse in the Haemophilia Centre. And just chatting with her over the time, we both felt what had happened to people with haemophilia and HIV was so dramatic, and a piece of history that shouldn't be lost, and we both wanted some way of capturing it. And then a good friend of mine died, and he had had a very dramatic life, and we'd missed doing it, and so we were sort of looking for a way to capture this, and we hadn't really got any idea at the beginning. And then Sian started going out with a guy who did oral history. And I thought, oh, that sounds good. So presumably if she'd gone out with a publisher, we'd have written a book. And so we got some training in oral history through his contacts, learned how to do it, how to do the interviews, what kind of things you ask. We applied for funding. We were turned down by one trust. And then we got funding from the lottery, Heritage Lottery. And we collected together, we then advertised through Birchgrove, the Haemophilia Society, the Macfarlane Trust weekends. I think we managed to get things in the Macfarlane Trust newsletter as well. Who would like to record their story? And it's their life story. So not just the HIV bit, but the haemophilia bit, the hepatitis C bit, treatment, early life, childhood. And we collected that, and the British Library wanted to store it, so we stored it there. And once we'd finished, we then realised, and it became very obvious, there's a whole group of people we've missed here, and that's the ones who've died, and it's the families, the relatives of these people. So we got another round of funding, and we interviewed parents, children, nephews, uncles, mothers, brothers, sisters, as many people who were close to someone. And they weren't all someone who died, but for the majority of them, it was where someone had died. And we then stored that at the British Library, and we made a website. And I know the inquiry has taken those transcripts and recordings, and it was very powerful. I was actually here the day when a widow came and spoke, and she asked that a recording of her husband be played. And I knew him, but that allowing him to give evidence after he died was, a very powerful thing. And those stories are very powerful.
That sense of capturing the stories, capturing the history, maybe an obvious question, but why is it so important? Why do you consider that to be such an important part of what's happened?
Partly because it was so silent before that, because there were very few people with haemophilia who had done things like media work or been open, very few who'd been involved in the HIV sector itself, and therefore the story was very unknown. There was that, drama of the impact of first cryo, then changing to concentrate, and then HIV, and then Hep C, and living, or for certainly a lot of the relatives, the deaths of people. And I mentioned a bit about patient involvement as a thing. I certainly, and Sian as well, we wanted people in the future to be able to go back and discover what had happened and to recognise how that had affected people, for them to describe it in their own words, for it not to be a history written by other people, but a thing for those people, said by those people. And I know a number of people used their own stories as a way of providing background to relatives, or some, in the case of a new partner, and for the bereaved, a way of having something that they'd got of the person who died.
Similarly, but different, while you were chair of Birchgrove, you were also heavily involved in establishing the memorial at Birchgrove Wood. Can you tell us a little bit about the role that's played for the community as a whole?
It becomes more of a memorial as time goes on. Although the phrasing on it is a celebration, we wanted it to be a celebration of the 1,200 lives, the 1,200 people who were infected. And it came about because, it looked like the Haemophilia Society were never going to do a memorial of any kind to people infected through blood products or infected with HIV. They had their service, but that was all. And as Birchgrove, we didn't want something that was just about the people who died. We wanted it about the people who were still alive. And so we sponsored 1,200 trees in a wood near Swindon. And then we worked with the Woodland Trust to provide some other additions. There's a bench so you can sit down, because a lot of people with haemophilia can't walk very well. And we commissioned a large stone, piece of sandstone, that's about, it's probably 3 foot by 4 foot, so it's quite big, and it has a legend, I think they call it, which is, this wood celebrates the lives of the 1,200 people infected with HIV through blood products. And then it could be a place people could come to know that there was a physical representation of what had happened, or as a place to act as a memory. And it's a nice walk, just to walk round the wood and the trees there. And then we had a day when we unveiled the stone, and 2 people, one who's now died, Hayden, and his wife who gave evidence, they created it was a sort of green cloth with a red ribbon made out of 1,200 red ribbons. It was actually 1,000 because the last 200 didn't fit. But and we draped that over, and then we pulled that off to reveal it. And a number of us made speeches, and I believe a recording of one of the things said was played at Cardiff. This feels to me an important piece of history, and it's a bit odd now that we've had a public inquiry that's made it so much more public, and it wasn't at that stage. And both that and the Life History Project were ways of making it more public, but without breaching anyone's confidentiality, not doing anything people didn't want. And it's a place, people will go to, and we've used it for meetings every so often, and it becomes an excuse to go to the wood.
Excuse me. Just pausing there and thinking more broadly. Oh, excuse me.
Do you want to take a moment?
Sorry.
Do you want to take a moment?
I'm so sorry.
Don't worry. We can have a 5-minute break if you like.
I think I'm back to normal, sir. Sorry, my voice just caught on some water. Thinking about those projects to capture the history and the lived experience of people who've been through this situation, what's your view of whether your lived experience and those of others has been valued by the medical community or the establishment?
It's definitely been valued in the HIV sector. That sounds awful, and I suspect it's been valued a bit more in the Hep C sector. The current, I don't know that many current haemophilia clinicians, but they certainly seem easier to get on with than the previous generation. It is important, and I've used particularly the Life History Project in teaching. There's a nursing course for haemophilia nurses. It runs every few years. And so, pardon me, predominantly because it's a speciality, haemophilia nursing, the nurses have often been working in a centre for a little while. It's not one you do before, it's one after you've got the job. And it's on a range of things, and I teach a bit about the history. And that's important for them, particularly because, and again, it's an obvious thing to say, but haemophilia is a genetic condition. So when if a woman who's got the haemophilia gene is pregnant and coming in for antenatal care, if it's been in her family a while, she will know people who've got HIV or Hep C, people who have died. And it is very likely they will come in with fears from the past, which makes sense, because particularly after someone dies, a family has no contact with the centre again. And if that's the next thing that brings them back, that comes with all the memories of that time and the fears of that time, and often a lack of knowledge that things might have changed. And that also, certainly for some of the nursing staff, they felt it helped them understand why some patients were so resistant to some things, so cautious, not really trusting, and why it was so hard, particularly for when other family members came in, particularly around a newborn, and the fears they brought. So it has been really useful with that. There's a point where I hope in some ways we've got so old and past it that will be much less useful, but it's always going to be an issue in haemophilia, and of what a disaster that happened with the treatment.
And a lot of your work has been around patient involvement, patient voice within medical decision making. In your view, what role should patient voice have?
Well, it should be powerful. As a patient, I want to make the decisions about what drugs I take. I want to use the information to make it. And a doctor comes and gives me advice, information, their thoughts, maybe their opinion, then I make the decision. I suspect partly because that didn't happen in haemophilia. That's why I ended up being a treatment activist and trying to know about it, so that I didn't even have to rely often on a doctor. I could make decisions about it myself and then go in and ask for it. But that's the way I should see it. We're the people these things happen to. We're the people who take these drugs. We're the people who have these bleeds. And our voice has to be, I hope, our voice is at least of an equal value with that of a clinician when we are deciding about what happens to us.
So those are the questions I have for Robert. I'm conscious there may be some questions from those behind me and those legal representatives who are watching online. I wonder if we take a short break at this stage.
Well, yes, let's take a break, and to allow people to participate fully, we'll come back at 2.
Thank you, sir.
So 2 o'clock.